Hi everybody, Professor Feist here, and I want to talk to you a little bit about Philip K. Dick, an American science fiction author, 1928 and 1982, so lived about 54 years, died quite young, but an amazingly prolific author, some 40 novels and a couple hundred short stories. So he has a huge output of material. He's born in Chicago. His parents didn't stay together for very long, so he moved around quite a bit, but ended up living with his mother, moving over to California, and spent the bulk of his life there. So in many ways, he's a California-type writer. He had some commercial success in his life, like a lot of artists, kind of poor when he started out, but towards the end of his life, he was being quite well recognized. Certainly scholars had discovered him. Some science fiction journals, as a matter of fact, before he passed away, had devoted whole issues of articles to his work. Now, it seems, according to the biographies of Philip K. Dick, that he lamented that he wasn't a mainstream author. He often referred to science fiction as a kind of literary ghetto, consisting of readers, he said, that are, quote, disturbed high school students, unquote. Now, I don't think that's really true, but it seems to have bothered him that he didn't achieve mainstream success. But nonetheless, as I mentioned, towards the end of his life, and certainly for the last 25, 30 years, the amount of academic interest in Philip K. Dick is incredible, and it's growing at a faster rate all the time. Why is there so much academic interest in Philip K. Dick? Well, there's a variety of reasons, and one of which is that Philip K. Dick explores a number of philosophical themes in his novels. And that's the angle that I approach his work. That's the main interest. But a number of scholars and critics approach his work in different ways. As I mentioned, he spent a lot of his life in California, so he's a Californian-American writer. He is writing his main materials in the 60s and the 70s, so he's a writer, an American writer, a California writer, and a writer of that time. So a lot of people read his works as social commentary about the 60s and the reactions in the 70s as well to the Vietnam War and to Nixonian government practices, etc., etc. So Philip K. Dick's works can be read in a variety of ways. As I mentioned, I'm more interested in the philosophical themes than other things. But there is something else about Philip K. Dick's work that can be lost in all the scholarly analysis and which perspective we should read them. Simply put, his works are fun to read. They're great fun to read. They're often quite funny, full of witty characters. They're often quite moving. Some of the characters, go through terrible situations. Sometimes they triumph, sometimes they don't. But he comes up with a world that's full of troubled and reflective characters. And so he invites us to look at the world in a variety of ways, which is what great art should do. It gets you to look at your own experience in a number of different ways. And as I said, they're just really fun. Some of his ideas are incredibly quirky and incredibly interesting. So he was clearly one of the best at writing that kind of literature. So it comes as no surprise that it's pretty easy to find Philip K. Dick, not the originals, of course, they're very expensive, but reprints. All of his novels, as far as I know, are in print, quite easy to find. Now, before we go into any more details concerning Philip K. Dick, his life and his works and all that, let's look at the notion of science fiction. Remember, he said it's a literary ghetto with an adolescent fan base. Is it? Should it be? Well, science fiction, we should ask, okay, what exactly are we talking about when we talk about science fiction? What does it mean? How should we define this term science fiction? It's the definition question. What is it? Well, there have been numerous attempts at this, and so you can go, there's lots of books written about how to organize all the works of science fiction so that you can get some sort of common theme or common ideas to try and define the term. That's an interesting project, but I'm not going to go into that here. Let's just look at Philip K. Dick's own approach to it. Sometimes he was very negative about it, but he did recognize that this kind of fiction had a very powerful tool at its disposal, namely the creation of worlds. So what does that really mean? Well, Philip K. Dick said, okay, it's not the story that defines science fiction, but the world, the setting. The science fiction setting, what is that? Well, it's our world plus a twist. And it was important that we get the twist right. That's the key to good science fiction, Philip K. Dick thought. Not so much the story. You can take any kinds of characters, or they don't always have to be aliens. They can just be regular people, no problem there. But it's their setting that's going to turn it into science fiction. Now, it's our world plus a twist. If you want to get science fiction, you got to do the twist right. Because if you have too much of a twist, you're off into the world of fantasy. It's not wrong to have a twist. It's not wrong to have a big one, but it's a different kind of genre, according to Philip K. Dick. And great works, of course, like The Lord of the Rings, have been written with a larger twist, because The Lord of the Rings is basically somewhat like our world with a twist. The setting is Middle-earth, but Middle-earth, the twist, it has magic in it. It has wizards, namely gray and white. And also, in addition to magic and wizards, you have these fantastic creatures like dragons. So it is our world, as Tolkien liked to say, but it has a fairly large twist on it by having magic and all these fantastic creatures. That is something in a way we characterize more fantasy than science fiction. So the science fiction twist, not too little, because if you have too little of a twist, you're doing a kind of realism and more mainstream fiction. And as I mentioned, Philip K. Dick wanted to be a mainstream writer, and he actually published a couple of mainstream novels, and there's no science fiction at all in them. But most of his work is, and he's clearly recognized for his science fiction. So the twist is not too little, not too much, but just right, the Goldilocks thing. Now, it's important to think about this twist, because the twist on our world creates all kinds of interesting things in the fiction itself. Because when you get the twist right, it often produces a very disquieting image or a world to enter when you start reading this stuff. So historically, science fiction has been very close to horror. So good science fiction is often like horror. And some of Philip K. Dick's works are quite disturbing to read, because they are like our world with a twist, and it is almost like reading certain kinds of horror fiction. Not violent, but just sort of that creepy sense of fiction when it's close to our world, but not quite the same. Now, as I said, historically, science fiction actually originates in horror fiction. Now, many debates about what exactly is the first science fiction novel go on continually, but some people say that really the great 19th century novel, Frankenstein, by Mary Shelley, is really the origin of science fiction. Now, many people think that the monster's name is Frankenstein, but that's not quite right. The scientist's name is Victor Frankenstein, and he creates and he builds this monster. So this is actually Frankenstein's monster. But what I want to draw your attention to, as I mentioned, you have this world with a twist. Here's an example of the twist, this sort of Goldilocks kind of twist. Have a look at the face on Frankenstein's monster. Now, clearly it looks like a human face, but not exactly. What the makeup artists and what they were trying to do here is to get a face that does look human, but not quite. You don't want it too far away so that it looks like something from another world, because that might be scary in one way, but it won't be quite creepy. What gives the creepy effect is that this is close to looking like a human, but not quite. So this closeness, but not identity, accounts for this disquieting feeling. And this has actually been noted, and there's a lot of debate about this. It's called the uncanny valley effect. It's a term used to describe how people react to images. As I said, there's a lot of debate, but it will help us, if we have a little bit of an understanding of this, it'll help us to get a grip on this notion of a good twist to produce good science fiction. So as something, either a stationary object or a moving one, increasingly resembles a human, as it starts to resemble a human, you'll notice as the line going up, the curve going up, the comfort level, or the familiarity that we have, that increases as well. But when it gets too close to looking like us, but not identical, it plummets. The familiarity that we feel regarding the object starts to basically takes a nosedive. That valley occurs. So, and then as the human likeness increases, gets even closer, the comfort level goes back up. So there seems to be a psychological reaction that we have. When things start to look more like us, we get comfortable. But when they're really close but not quite, we become suddenly very uncomfortable. And then as it looks more and more like us, we start getting comfortable again. So this getting comfortable and this dip and then back up, that's called the uncanny valley effect. And a lot of authors trade on this. A lot of movies trade on this. To make it look just creepy, you make it look a lot like a person, but just not quite. So here's an example, right? This image, it clearly looks like a person, but yet not quite. There's something odd about it. It's very close, so if you actually took it and made it a little bit closer, it would be less creepy, and if you took it and moved it away, it would be less. This is often referred to as hitting the dip in the uncanny valley effect. All right, so let's go back to Philip K. Dick. This is also a model of him, which has a little bit of the uncanny valley effect as well. All right, so it's this juxtaposition of the familiar and the strange in the right mixture. That's what good science fiction does. So, who was Philip K. Dick, right? Is my next question. Well, there have been a lot of biographies of him. The standard biography of Philip K. Dick is the one by Lawrence Sutton. Appears about 1989. Several have appeared since, and there's a number before. But this one is pretty hard to improve upon. As mentioned, he's an American author, and at heart a Californian, and comes of age. Now, it's important to look at Philip K. Dick as a writer in a context. He comes of age in what was the golden age of science fiction, and so he's a young boy. He's reading science fiction as a kid, and so this shaped a lot of the ideas that he had. And you can go and you can trace a lot of the ideas in his books, trace it back to some of the earlier writers. And of course, he takes that's very common for an artist to be influenced, but to then add their own twists on these ideas. Now, the ideas in the golden age of science fiction, some of the key themes. Well, there was a lot of discussion about robots. Isaac Asimov's classic collection of stories about robots and how they were to serve humanity, how they could get out of control. So the wonders and dangers of technology are at play here. Space travel, of course, was big. What would happen, though, as people asked in this one by A.E. Van Vogt, the classic one, The Voyage of the Space Beagle, is to ask, well, what would happen if you had a group of people traveling in space and an alien got on board? A.E. Van Vogt was a Canadian author, and he tells this story in The Space Beagle of a very nasty alien that gets on board and terrorizes the crew. And if you think this sounds a lot like the movie Alien, absolutely. It's the same idea of encountering an alien life form that's not friendly at all, and in this case has to use us basically to live off of. So not interested in discussion in any way. So in addition to robots and space travel, you have another key theme was religion and spirituality. And for the keys of religion and the key theme of religion and spirituality, you have a classic work by James Blish called A Case of Conscience. Now, centuries ago, when the Europeans came to the Americas, there was a great debate amongst European scholars as to whether or not the native North Americans had souls. James Blish takes this theme and transports it in space and asks, would we try to convert aliens to our religion? Would they have souls? How would we determine this? And Blish actually borrows documents from the Vatican, which has policies, by the way, on this issue of what to do when you encounter aliens in religious context. And he constructs a novel about religious conversion in outer space. Picking up on this is Walter Miller's classic, A Canticle for Leibowitz. It's set on Earth just after a nuclear war, and the only institution left is the Catholic Church. Humanity is engaged in rebuilding itself after this nuclear devastation, and The Catholic Church is the main institution that preserves all knowledge, much like the fall of the Roman Empire. So it's a cyclical view of history. Humanity keeps destroying itself, builds itself up, destroys itself, and goes on and on. I won't give away the ending. It's very cool, and you should read it for yourself. These themes, robots, creatures alien creatures that are dangerous, alien creatures that pose religious and theological problems, cyclical notions of history. These are all things that show up in Philip K. Dick's work. Now, in Philip K. Dick's work, I've divided it into three main periods: the early, the middle, and the late. So very simple division. The early period was the development of a writer, 1928 to about 1960. The middle period I call the astonishing decade. That's 1960 to 1970. And I pick out, he's got a number of books, like several books, and much of his great work was written in this time. Not all of it, but a lot of it was written in this time. I'm picking out two books that I'm going to talk about in a moment. The 1962 publication of The Man in the High Castle, and the 1968 publication of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. The late period, which I labeled from 1970 to 1982, where he was talking, his novels are concerned with drugs and religion. And he wrote a number of novels, anti-drug novels, about the devastating effects that he has actually witnessed that drugs have had upon himself and the people that he knew. Now, The Man in the High Castle. This is arguably what has been his breakout novel. That is, The Man in the High Castle brought him major attention. He had been known, as I said, but this one brought him major attention. It won the Hugo Award for Best Science Fiction. The Hugo Award is an award given out for the best science fiction novel of a given year. And he won it for Best Novel of 1962. It's a classic novel of alternative history, and this has been done before by a number of authors, where the United States loses World War II and is occupied by Nazi Germany on its east coast and Japan on its west coast, as indicated more or less by the cover. Now, it's very difficult to summarize what this novel is. Philip K. Dick himself was a bit hesitant to try and summarize it, and said that the novel itself really doesn't have a coherent narrative and certainly doesn't have an ending. And he, from what we know, seemed to have dabbled in trying to write a couple sequels to tie it up. Nonetheless, it's a fantastic novel, very interesting. It actually consists of a number of stories within the setting of this occupied America. So you see, it's an America with a twist, losing the war. It's hard to summarize it, but I'll point out something very philosophically interesting about this novel. One of the characters in the novel, so there's various stories that are going on in this novel, and they interact and overlap. But one interesting story is there is a character in this novel that is writing a novel. Pretty standard stuff. But this character that's writing the novel in a novel is writing about the end of World War II, where the United States won the war. So inside of the alternative history, you have a character trying to write the real history. Now, of course, this character that's in the novel trying to write the real history is embedded in the context of the alternative history. So it's not like us, as a historian, playing the historian and writing the history of what happened, because we're in the real world of what happened. This is a fictional character trying to write the story of a fictional past. So what does this really say? Well, you can look at this and go, well, that's kind of quirky and weird, and it is, and interesting and fun. You could leave it at that, but you could also look at it as a commentary that's a little bit deeper. That is, in the novel, the real timeline, the truth, the real timeline is contained, that is, the U.S. victory is contained within a fictional timeline, namely that the U.S. lost. So you have the notion of the real being embedded in fiction. Well, this seems to be, in many ways, a commentary on truth. You don't have access directly to truth. You're always embedded in fictions, trying to figure out, trying to distill what the truth might be. In other words, truth is something that always comes in a kind of context. How we see the world, in particular, depends on the story we tell about the world in general. Think about how during political campaigns, everybody is talking about trying to establish the main narrative, and that will give shape to any other issue that's going on in the campaign. Whoever gets to establish the narrative gets to establish the so-called truths that will emerge. So in this case, we've got a novel trying to give us an idea of a commentary on the nature of truth. And we'll see Philip K. Dick at the end talk a little bit about how he thinks about truth and what he thinks, how it relates to fiction. So that's for The Man in the High Castle. A number of years later, well, there were novels in between these two, but towards the end of the 60s, he publishes Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? This is a post-nuclear war novel. It's, again, dangers, as we've seen, of technology gone wild. And something that Philip K. Dick talked about was 24-hour-a-day media. Now, this is in the 60s. So we're used to this now, 24-hour-a-day media, you know, with the internet and news channels that run 24 hours. We're comfortable with that. But in the 60s, this was very strange notion. So there's some implications and some predictions of the 24-hour-a-day media that Philip K. Dick talks about in this novel, which you can judge for yourself when we look at it, whether or not he got it right, or whether or not he's totally off, or partially, or whatnot. But it's basically a detective story of hunting down androids, but it deals a lot with themes of dehumanization. For the detective, as he has to chase down androids, has to confront certain emotions in himself and what seem to be emotions in the androids. So what happens to human emotions after the war, after radiation comes in, after endless brutality takes its toll, and you get a theme of dehumanization. Another theme is explored is the notion of religion, fraud, empathy. Notion of artificial animals, because at the end of the war it caused a lot of deaths in the animals, and so human beings, having a natural desire to relate to animals, start making their own and building their own. And it raises another question about our relationship with inanimate objects. So in this context for Philip K. Dick, he was talking about building an animal, right, an electric sheep, and how to relate to this. But today, we have the same thing. How do we relate to our gadgets? You hear people, they're in love with their cell phones, couldn't live without them. How do we relate to these things? And it's a question of, again, what is this doing to us the more we relate to objects and things outside our species? Do they come and take on lives of their own? So in this case, Philip K. Dick explores a number of themes, and one of the key ideas in this novel is, okay, at the end of it all, if you have relationships with non-human objects, and you have real relationships, what does that mean in the end to be human? He leaves that as an open question, but provides a lot of interesting analysis. Shortly before passing away, I just want to make this one note. Philip K. Dick commented on his body of work, and it ties back to what I said about the novel The Man in the High Castle. Here's a quotation. What I have done may be good, it may be bad. But the reality that I discern is the true reality. Thus, I am basically analytical, not creative. My writing is simply a creative way of handling analysis. Here's the key thing. I am a fictionalizing philosopher, Philip K. Dick says, not a novelist. My novel and story writing ability is employed as a means to formulate my perception. His art is a means to get a perception on the world. Fictionalizing philosopher, what does that mean? Well, he says the core of my writing is not art. Art is a vehicle for him. It's truth. Thus, what I tell is the truth. Well, at least he thinks it is, but maybe it is. Yet I can do nothing to alleviate it, either by deed or explanation. So he thinks that art is a vehicle of truth. And again, as in the Man in the High Castle, talked about the narrative structure surrounding the attempt of that one writer in the novel to get to truth. Maybe it is that truth only emerges through art, or that truth only emerges through larger structures. This is what he means, essentially, by this notion of a fictionalizing philosopher. The goal is truth, not just art for art's sake. Thank you.